Wendy Williams and I, we do these often. We haven't done them for a couple of weeks, but today we have a special guest, Jayne Warrilow, and I'm going to read her, at least elements of her bio. She is the founder of something called Sacred Changemakers, which I'm going to ask her about. She's also the CEO of the Coaches Business School, which is a training company that helps coaches succeed by building a conscious business. She's one of the world's leading executive business coaches, and she has private clients that are strictly by invitation or referral. And she's born in England, as you can see by, when you listen to her talk. And she's worked with leading organizations and individuals in the United States, Europe, Asia, Australia, and Latin America, and now lives and works, believe it or not, out of Columbus, Ohio.
Why are we all laughing when we say that?
Give me all these glamorous things, and we have to end with Columbus, Ohio. It just doesn't seem right.
I know, it's much better. Like if you'd caught me like 2 years ago and I was living out of LA in
there
California.
You go, right? That'd be glamorous, right?
That's much better.
So Jayne, we're really here to talk about, you're going to do this event for us, us being the Sacred Inclusion Network is it the 15th or the 19th? It's 2 Saturdays from now, yeah. that are called Sacred Circle Gathering. But before we get to that, we started talking, the three of us, a little bit about your origin story, because I know that you used to be deeply involved in being a corporate person. You still do some corporate work, I understand, but you also do some interesting things that involve, for example, channeling and working with business people, all these kind of woo-woo things that most business-oriented people would not, if they were into them, they would not let people know about them. So
right.
Tell us a little bit about your origin story, if you don't mind, Jayne.
Oh yeah, I don't. And it is an interesting one. And I guess in many ways I'm still living it. So, I guess, so if I look back into my childhood, it was a very kind of spiritually oriented childhood. My grandma used to do the tarot cards. She was a medium and a clairvoyant, and she fascinated me. And she did die when I think I was 11 or 12 when she died. But up until that point, I'd been so fascinated by, she used to talk about the invisible in life. And she used to say that, the invisible is what mattered most. And I never really understood that as a child, but I was fascinated nonetheless. And this grew into, she taught me how to read tarot cards when I was about 10. And so I learned it in this very kind of experiential way from my grandma and learned to love it. I hadn't kind of come across any of the dark side of the tarot or how people can think it's evil or different things like that. I was in this little bubble, I guess. And so I was very open and curious as a child. And I knew that as I got into my teen years, I was still interested in this thing that my nan had talked about the invisible in our world, and how that if you can kind of go beneath the surface of life, there's all kinds of depths that's just waiting there, information waiting there for you. So I was fascinated by this, and it kind of put me on a path, I wasn't ever really into organized religion, but definitely into spirituality. And in England, we have quite a tradition of spirituality and medium and clairvoyancy. And, we have like the British Institute and different places where you can go to learn some of what I would say are more kind of ancient Celtic tools or Wiccan tools or pagan. We can use all these, and they're still kind of integrated into life in a way in some parts of England. So that was where I started. Then of course I went to college and school, and was still interested in the invisible, but it manifested in things like, for my degree, my first dissertation I wrote was on fringe medicine, because I was interested in the alternative, not what had become mainstream, but how had we got the mainstream medical profession that we'd got, and how had we ended up with all these other pieces of medicine that were thought to be less than because they were, aromatherapy or osteopathy at that time, because this was back in the 80s when osteopathy was still seen as very fringe and alternative. So I remember doing research into that, and that then got me into healing and spiritual healing, and realizing the difference between like traditional medicine and what it means to be a healer, and then went down the energy medicine path and the spiritual healing path. And this was like my like closeted weekend world. And in the week I was like doing leadership development training in corporate organizations. In the UK I was first licensed as an occupational psychologist, and so it was in occupational psychology that I learned a lot of my systems theory and different work that I did. But I was really into strategic business, and even back then, when I look back at it now, I was interested in business as a force for good in the world, not just to make a profit, right? I was always into that leadership space and the combination between being and doing. And I got really good. I mean, I set up my first business in '96, and we did really well. I was operating out of a Covent Garden, London office, and we were doing really well. And I ended up, because I was in London, I ended up working pan-European first, and then I became one of the first women consultants that was self-employed in the global space pretty early on, because I was working with a lot of global headquarters inside of London that would then bring people in for training. So I got a global mindset very early on. And then in the year 2001, I gave birth to my third child, Jacob, and sustained a massive medical injury in the process that was misdiagnosed for nearly 11 months. When I finally collapsed in front of this is true, in front of a board in London, and it's a brand you'll know, that I was working with, I literally collapsed in front of them. And at the time I lived outside of London in quite a rural area, so the hospital was not really a cutting edge hospital, and they hadn't managed to diagnose me. But because I kind of fell apart in London, I got some top doctors and they diagnosed me immediately. And from then on, I had a number of surgeries, nothing worked. Ended up in 2004 with a terminal diagnosis where I had bladder, kidneys, and spinal cord issues. And the pain was excruciating. I'd been bedridden for 3 years. I'd had to sell my consultancy. And what was so like traumatic about that was I was then told, basically a doctor told me to go home and make the most of the time I had left with my children. And that's a devastating sentence to be given. And so I fell apart. But then what was interesting was life wouldn't kind of let me stay down, because about 8 weeks after that diagnosis, I got a call from an old client who hadn't known that I'd sold my consultancy and been ill, and just said, "Jayne, I need you." So here I am, like barely walking. I was in a wheelchair, and I took this call and I thought, I need to help him. I need to help him. So my husband drove me down to London, because I was living up in the north of England back near my family, and drove me down to London. It was about a 5-6 hour drive. Waited in the car park. I kind of went in because I didn't know I didn't know if the pain would kick in, if I'd collapse, what would happen. And I went in, and as I walked across to my client's corner office, again, it's a brand you'll know, a really big global brand. All I could feel, Angelo, was the energy just leaking out of my body. And I remember going into fight or flight and thinking, has it always been like this in corporate and I've just never noticed? Like, where's the energy in this office? It's not here. Nobody's alive. It's like The Walking Dead. And that was when my two worlds I knew had to come together. That was the point where I realized that, you know, the work, everything I knew about business and strategy and leadership needed to come together with everything I knew from my spiritual, my energy healing, and I needed to integrate the two. And when you do that, you see, once I'd opened myself to the energies and I started working with clients, I'd got good results before. In fact, I got great results before. I was really successful, but now we were at a whole different level. And so, yeah, that was when my worlds came together, everything integrated. And I knew now it's not just business. Back then it was conscious business, but a more recent iteration of that has been sacred business. What does that mean? And that's my work.
I am so fascinated by so much of what you shared.
Yeah.
All my friends are fascinating. Don't you know this by now? You know, Jane, I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but I've always been fascinated by the tarot, and
Right.
one of your infamous countrymen, Aleister Crowley, was he was an influence. I loved Aleister Crowley, although he sort of died a drunk.
Right.
But I remember being fascinated by the tarot. I still am, actually,
Yeah.
because really the tarot is like a kind of esoteric Western philosophy.
Yes.
It's not just cards. There's a whole
Nope.
philosophy behind it, So in any event, so you started this thing called Sacred Change Makers. And
Yeah.
before we get to talking about the sacred circle gathering, tell us a little bit about Sacred Change Makers, what you do, and how people can get involved and what it is, and yeah.
Thank you. Well, Sacred Changemakers, I have to say, one of the funny stories I tell is that, I used to have a job, then I had a career, then I had a career with purpose, then I had a business, then I had a business with purpose. Now I have a calling, a sacred calling. That's what Sacred Changemakers is. It's not Jane in her head looking at the market and the economy and wondering what would be a really profitable business to run. That's not what this is. This is the thing I can't not do. And it stems from the fact that, as you said, I channel information. And in May 2019, I'd had some unexpected surgery. And just after that, I got myself into meditation to try and deal with some pain that I was having. And I got the signal that a message wanted to come through. And this is as simple for me now as like brushing my teeth, right, on a daily basis. I just reach for my iPhone. I've learned how to kind of move the personality of Jane out of the way and just allow my voice to be used for expression and messaging. And I did that. I captured it on my iPhone. I had no idea what I'd captured. And then I went back to my day. And then that evening before going to bed, I listened. And honestly, in that moment, my entire relationship with the world shifted. And in a way, this was the beginning of Sacred Changemakers, because it was an ancient story talking about this time now on Earth, and how a number of us are souls that have come back and incarnated at this time to help usher in the next evolution of humanity. And there was something inside of me that remembered. And I know it's really weird to say that, but it was like, yeah, I know this. I know this. I don't know how I know it. I don't know where I know it from, but I know that this is me. So at first I thought it was my purpose. And then I quickly realized it's not about I and me anymore. The future is in we. What are we going to do? And so I knew I needed to start a community, which is what Sacred Changemakers is about. Because when you step out in the world and do something, like if the whole world is going that way, like this is leadership, and I start going this way, going, actually, it's a sacred gift, is leadership. And it is about being a force for good. Because I realized I've been in change for over 3 decades. And in that time, I'd only ever served the changes my clients came to me for. So an individual human or a team or an organization would come to me and say, we have this problem, we need it solving, can you help? And I say, yes. Okay, we can help solve that problem. We can strategize and we can work around it. And what I've realized now is that's not wrong. It's just a very limited view of change. Now we need to also be asking, not just what do you want and what do you need, but what does the world need from you? And that's the bridge that Sacred Changemakers is, from the I conversation to the we. What do we need to do?
So,
I love that. Do you mind if
no, go ahead.
ask a question? So when you were telling your story, your origin story, you had mentioned being in the corporate environment, and the big aha moment when the energy drained out and your two worlds melded together. That, what you just said there, and following with your share about your existing community,
Yeah.
I was thinking, being a very spiritual person, the entire time that I was in corporate America, I would do energy work, but it was focused in a very small, narrow way. I used it to move through that environment in a way that was healthy for me. because the environment itself wasn't a match for who I am as a person. So I'm very, very curious about your experience widening the use of energy in the corporate arena. So
Yeah.
what does that look like when it goes beyond the individual and their own coping tools, which I became an expert at? I
Right.
used energy every day, energy work every day, but what does it look like when it's bigger than just for an individual's experience?
Yes. And I want to answer this in two different ways, because the first thing I want to say is really applaud you and thank you for actually speaking out that you were using energy work in organizations. Because I have to tell you, I was really scared of it felt like coming out of the closet and talking about what is seen as woo-woo kind of work. And it has no place in our thinking, mind, logical, rational, organizational life, right? But my first experience to tell you is that the amount of people that come up to me and say things like you just said, CEOs, C-level executives who are already aware of energy, but just don't know how to harness it within an organizational structure. So the first thing to say is there's very obvious ways that energy is harnessed in an organization, which is through different levels of system. So yes, you have the individual. And so everything starts from the inside out on a leadership journey. And that's, I'm sure, language that most people will understand. But then you get to teams. And then what's the energy of the team? And is that coherent in any way? And what is that energy aligning to? Because if you just have a lot of individuals that think they're in a team, then we don't actually have a team, we just have a group of individuals. But it's the coherence of the energy and then aligning that with the goals of the organization. So the organizational goals, to the departmental goals, to the team goals, to the individual goals. Every individual has to be able to bring themselves to work, which means if these things are not aligned, the individuals feel like they can't be themselves at work, right? So we have to look at the alignment. And then we have to look at how, as leaders particularly, which I've worked with a lot of leaders, how do we harness the individual, let's call it the genius of every person coming in? Because a lot of organizations hold the view that we need to recruit to this competence framework and we need this and then we want this, and it's all like machines. And what leaders forget is that it's an organization is just a human energetic system. And it's co-created, the energy is co-created by every individual from the janitor right the way to the CEO. So then how are we harnessing that? And how does everybody find their place within the system and understand their role and their responsibility and their boundaries and understand what alignment feels like in their body, not just in their head, but what it feels like to actually walk your talk and live your message. And it's that embodiment, I think, that really makes a difference. Because when I go into an organization, chances are most people are just like brains and the only function that their body has is to move their brain to another meeting. Well, we need to get people whole first so they understand their own individual ecosystem of energy, and then find how that fits into the alignment of whatever other systems they're part of in the culture, in the teams, in the departments, and in the organization. And then you see, I go even further now, and I would say in the world as a whole, what's your contribution? Why do you exist?
I love all of that so much. Thank you.
I want to sort of steer us to Saturday, the 19th at 11 a.m. Jayne is going to lead us in something called a Sacred Circle Gathering. And rather than start by asking you what it is, I know that you share with me a little bit that at one point, many years ago, you went to such a thing, and you've sort of continued the traditions. Maybe you tell us a little bit about that. And it does come from I'm probably going to say it right. I always want to say Celtic, but you pronounce it differently.
Celtic, yeah.
Celtic framework. So please educate us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I was on a spiritual retreat. It was in my early 20s, and it was very much a mindfulness, although that really wasn't a word then, meditative retreat. And it was very much about kind of getting in touch with yourself and your own impulses and potentially your own purpose and calling in the world, what wanted to emerge through you. That was kind of what it was about. And the end of the retreat, they ended with a sacred circle gathering. So it was so fascinating to me that we'd kind of been together for 5 days. And then at the end of this retreat, we did what was like a ritual, but it was actually, the way it was set up was very, well, it was a very thoughtful, deep practice into where I was and what I was thinking and feeling and sensing into at in many different ways, really. So it made me look at myself and my own sense of being and becoming in a way that was very individual to me. So it's a very intimate process, but it was deep and reflective and enabled me to find my own way, because I'm not very good with prescribed like frameworks where you have to do A, B, C, and you've got to do B before C. Like, I'm not great with rules. So this was a structure that enabled me to find myself within it. And in fact, enabled everyone in the retreat to have a very different outcome. Now, in group situations, you see, this fascinated me. I was in my early 20s and I'd only really had experience at that point of everybody like getting on the same page, you know, that kind of thing, everybody doing the same thing. And this was a way that even though we were in a group and we were sharing, we were all able to have our own individual kind of unique expression of where we were and what was calling to us at that time. And so I actually didn't do anything with it at first. And then as I was running groups, I started to, after my own healing, this was one of the first practices I used to bring into leadership development retreats. And I used to open the retreat with the circle, and people would have an experience at the beginning. And then I would end with it as well, because there's some real sacred energy. Of course, it's a sacred circle. But when you hold sacred energy for anything, there's something really interesting that happens energetically. Like, energy gets activated, it gets cleansed. It's like life steps forward to kind of meet you in your intentions. And so that's why I've come back to the sacred circle as a ritual, and also as a practice, a spiritual practice, a sacred practice of reminding myself of what is most important to me. And it's been my own individual practice now for well over a decade. And I've only fairly recently started doing it in groups again. And we're now doing it virtually. And it's working incredibly well.
Oh, we're delighted.
Yeah, so really looking forward to taking your people through it.
So what could people expect?
Yeah, well, if you think about a compass, a really easy way to think about the different directions of the circle is to think like we have a compass, you know, we have north, east, south, and west, and every one of those directions represents a different perspective on life. Then we also, we will be using each of those different directions in the sacred circle gathering. We'll also be using up and down, which is like 6 directions, but we use 7 directions, which is in this very center of the circle. We all come together, where that's a place of integration. It's a very sacred space. And that's where we start to integrate our learnings from all the different directions previously and start to bring it into something coherent we can take back into our life.
Oh, it's tremendously exciting. Yeah. Now, I remember, like, in the maybe last question, I remember you when we talked about this virtually, you mentioned the 9 directions, which I'm familiar with, because in men's work, a lot of times we start our men's gatherings by doing honoring the different directions and above, below, and the ancestors, etc. You mentioned that part of it will be, you'll ask a couple of different questions for each direction. I wonder if you could give me an example of maybe what you're referencing with that.
Yeah, so it's all about bridging the space between the me, which is my individual experience, and what the world needs or wants from me, or what wants to emerge through me. So there's a very there's different levels of questioning. Like, if I say to myself, like, what's my purpose? There's a level of questioning, that's demanding a level of answer that is really quite, it's not very deep. Like I can say, okay, my purpose is to, I don't know, change the world or something. But then if I say, well, what is it that wants to emerge through me? Now we're at a different energetic frequency, because now it's less about Jayne figuring it out in her head, and it's more about Jayne listening deeply to what wants to emerge through me. So when we use questions in the different directions, what we're doing is we're really bridging this gap. Like I will ask like an I question. So it might be something like, you know, what matters most to me right now in this direction? And then it might also be, but what does the world need from me? Or what does life want from me in this direction? So we're looking at these different, it's almost like if you imagine a line with the polarities at different ends, at one end there's me and at the other end there is we. And what we're doing with the questioning is integrating the two. So we're kind of holding space for both. Because one of the things that I've realized as I'm moving more and more in this direction with Sacred Changemakers is that there's a view out there, and I don't quite know where it's come from. There's a line of thinking that you can either be corporate and business and like smart and intelligent, or you can be like woo-woo and over there with the angel lady and a bit like flaky over there. Whereas what I'm saying is the future demands both. So we need to know how to hold space for both.
Well, this is going to be great. It's like September 19th, 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. I will post the URL in the chat. Wendy, do you have anything else you would like to ask Ms. Warrilow?
I just love everything you said. It really aligns with the purpose of my own coaching business. I consider myself to be on the transition team. The changes will take place far beyond my lifetime, but I'm here to help facilitate that change. I love everything about it. I'm excited.
Fantastic.
Very much in line with
Fantastic.
Sacred Inclusion Network too, what we're doing. So we're
Love
coming
it.
together to do that. And I'm just so looking forward to it, Jayne. As I said, I'm going to put a description in the chat. And gosh, we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yeah, see you then. So honored. Thank you for inviting me. Looking forward
well,
to
I'm
it.
glad that you accepted. Thank you so much.